Just picture it. The last embers of the Roman Empire still glowing, but just barely, inside the massive walls of Constantinople. For 1,000 years, that city had been a fortress against the world. But now, two colossal storms were gathering on the horizon, ready to change everything. The great historian Edward Gibbon really just sets the stage perfectly here. This is a story of a spectacular fall and an unstoppable rise, a real turning point in history, where one world is about to end and a new one is ready to be born. The stakes? Well, they couldn't be any higher. All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to follow these two great storms that literally reshape the world. First up, this sudden, violent explosion of the Mongols coming out of the east. And then, right from the wreckage they leave behind, we get the slow, methodical, relentless rise of the Ottomans. It all leads to a final showdown for the city that will change the course of history. Okay, our first storm kicks off on the huge, wind-swept plains of Central Asia. And it all starts with this one barbarian leader named Temujin, an orphan, on the run as a kid, who would rise up through just sheer force of will to become one of the most feared conquerors of all time, the great Zingis Khan. So, how did he do it? Well, Zingis Khan's story, it's not one of heroism. It's written in blood. He didn't just beat his rivals, he absolutely annihilated them. See, he understood that to build a world-spanning empire from scratch, fear was his most powerful weapon. His cruelty became the stuff of legend, but here's the thing, it was never random. It was always, always strategic. I mean, just look at this stuff. It's horrifying, but you have to see the method in the madness. Boiling rebels alive? That sends a crystal clear message to anyone else even thinking about crossing him. Turning a rival's skull into a silver-lined cup? That is the ultimate power move. This was calculated terror, designed to shatter an enemy's will to fight before the battle even started. And this is the great paradox of the man. Abroad, he was a savage conqueror. But at home, within his own empire, Zingis set up a surprisingly modern and strict rule of law. He punished crimes like murder and adultery with death, which created the strange kind of peace. And maybe most amazing of all, he decreed total religious freedom, a concept the so-called civilized world of Europe wouldn't get to for centuries. So after Zingis Khan died, you might think things would calm down. Oh no. His sons and grandsons basically took his war machine and cranked it up to 11. They became a force of nature, a human hurricane that would completely redraw the map of the 13th century. The speed of it all is it's staggering. In a little over 60 years, they conquered almost all of Asia and smashed their way right into the heart of Europe. Entire civilizations, empires that had stood for hundreds of years were just washed away by this unstoppable tide. To give you a sense of their power, just think about this. The Sultan of Khazim, one of the most powerful rulers in the entire Muslim world, comes at the Mongols with an army of 400,000 men, a massive force. In the first battle alone, 160,000 of his soldiers were killed. The Mongol army was just on a completely different level. And yet in this total shipwreck of nations, Constantinople somehow survived. The Mongol storm was raging all around it. They wiped out the caliphate in Baghdad, they crushed the Turks in Anatolia, but the city itself was spared. It was saved by a mix of being far away, a bit of luck, and the fact that the Mongol leaders started fighting amongst themselves. The first great storm, it passed them by. But like any storm, even one that big, the Mongol fury couldn't last forever. The largest land empire in history began to crack, and as it fell apart, the world it left behind was changed forever. So what happens? Well, the descendants of Zingis, like his grandson Kublai Khan over in China, they started to adopt the ways of the people they'd conquered. They became Chinese bureaucrats or Persian Muslims. The single, unified Mongol identity just dissolved, and their giant empire shattered into a bunch of warring kingdoms. And here is the absolute key takeaway. The Mongol storm, as it faded, created this huge power vacuum. It had smashed all the old powers of the region, and into that empty space, a brand new force was about to rise. So, Now we meet the second storm, and the Ottomans, they were not a sudden flash flood like the Mongols. No, they were more like a rising tide, slow, methodical, incredibly disciplined, and permanent. They started as just a tiny little tribe on the edge of the dying Roman world, literally born from its wreckage. The real engine behind this new power was this idea of the Ghazi. These were holy warriors fighting to expand the lands of Islam. This wasn't just about conquering for gold and glory. It was about conquering with a divine mission. And that gave them a zeal, a resilience that was incredibly powerful. The Ottomans also came up with a military innovation that was, frankly, both brilliant and absolutely terrifying: the Janissaries. It started with this brutal tax on their Christian subjects. Not a tax of money, but a tax of children. The strongest, brightest young boys were taken from their families. They were converted to Islam, put through years of brutal training in warfare, and educated to have loyalty to one person and one person only, the Sultan. Then they were consecrated as new soldiers, an elite, fanatical fighting force, forged from the sons of their enemies. And this blessing, right from their founding, it just perfectly captures this mix of military might and religious purpose. The Janissaries weren't just soldiers. They were seen as a sacred brotherhood, the sharpest edge of the Sultan's sword. So this new power is soon in the hands of Sultan Bajazet, a man whose incredible energy and speed earned him the nickname Al-Darim, the Lightning. And in just 14 years, he absolutely stormed across Asia and Europe, from the Euphrates River all the way to the Danube. Bajazet's relentless conquest finally gets the attention of Western Europe. The bravest knights from France and Germany, who saw themselves as the peak of military might, they gather this huge crusading army to go and stop him. This was supposed to be the ultimate showdown. Well, the battle was a complete catastrophe, and it was born from pure arrogance. The French knights, literally drunk on wine and pride, just ignored all strategy. They laughed at their allies, demanded they get to lead the charge, and just rushed headlong into battle with no orders. They were brave, for sure, but they were a chaotic mob, and Bajazet's disciplined professional army just took them apart, annihilated them. And Bajazet's message to the captured French leader afterwards, man, it is just bone-chilling. He wasn't just confident, he was completely contemptuous of his enemies. After this victory, he felt invincible, and his eyes turned to the ultimate prize. And so, we come back to Constantinople. The first storm, the Mongols, had passed it by. But this second storm, the Ottoman tide, it hadn't just reached the city's shores. It had swallowed up everything around it. You really have to feel the claustrophobia of this moment for the last Romans. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the land in Europe and the land in Asia. The emperor in Constantinople, he wasn't an emperor of an empire anymore. He was the ruler of a single city, a prisoner behind his own ancient walls. And then the lightning strikes. Bayezid sends his final ultimatum to the emperor. The terms are brutally simple. Give me the city and name your reward. Refuse and tremble at what's coming next. There's no negotiation, no diplomacy. This is the endgame. So, the city is completely cut off. Its allies in Europe have been crushed. Its enemy is at the gates, demanding total surrender. The 1,000-year Roman Empire is on the very brink of being snuffed out. In this final fatal moment, what could possibly save it now?
Today, we are digging into the life of one of history's most incredible and, frankly, terrifying figures, the 14th century conqueror Timour, or as he's better known in the West, Tamerlane. His legacy is just a storm of contradictions. He's a man whose life was recorded in shocking detail, and yet, he's still a total mystery.
Okay, just let that sink in for a second. This one sentence from the historian Edward Gibbon tells you everything you need to know. We are not talking about some regional warlord here. Tamerlane's goal was nothing less than the entire world. The scale of his ambition is almost impossible to wrap your head around, and what's crazy is he almost pulled it off.
And that right there, that's the big question, isn't it? Who was this guy really? Was he a unifier, this charismatic leader who brought order out of total chaos? Or was he one of history's greatest monsters, a destroyer who literally paved his way with pyramids of human skulls? So let's investigate both faces of Tamerlane.
All right, first up, his rise from the desert. Tamerlane wasn't born into royalty. He was the son of a minor tribal chief, born into a time of complete anarchy. He didn't inherit an empire. He had to forge one from nothing, with just his own willpower, his charisma, and, his genius on the battlefield. His story starts not in a palace, but out in the wilderness.
I mean, his early career was a total roller coaster. At 25, he's being called a hero, the deliverer of his country. Next thing you know, he's a fugitive, hiding in the desert with just 60 guys. Then he's captured, thrown in a dungeon for 2 months, and asked to escape on his own. It took him nearly a decade of these wild swings between triumph and disaster before he finally secured his throne. This was not a simple climb to the top. It was a brutal, relentless fight for survival.
And you can feel that magnetic personality in his own memoirs. He tells this story about finding his loyal followers again after being lost in the desert. And the scene is just so emotional. You have these hardened warriors literally weeping with joy. This shows you it wasn't just a commander and his soldiers. This was a deep bond forged in pure hardship that would eventually carry him to the throne of Asia.
But that loyalty, it was built on something much, much darker. The same man who inspired that kind of devotion was also responsible for some of the most horrific atrocities you can imagine. As his empire got bigger, so did the trail of blood and destruction. This is where we meet the second face of Tamerlane.
Now listen to this, get this. He's saying this to the learned men of Aleppo, a city his army is actively conquering as he speaks. He's painting himself as this pious, reluctant warrior, a tool of God's will who only fights because other people make him. It is an amazing piece of propaganda.
But here is the chilling reality. While Tamerlane is having this deep, philosophical chat, his soldiers are sacking the city. The streets were, and I'm quoting here, streaming with blood, and his troops were following his signature, gruesome order, to build towers and pyramids out of the severed heads of the dead. The difference between his words and his actions, it's just staggering.
And Aleppo wasn't a one-off. After he conquered the great city of Baghdad, his troops built a monument out of 90,000 human heads. You have to understand, this wasn't just the chaos of battle. This was calculated, systematic terror. It was designed to crush any idea of ever resisting him again. So eventually, Tamerlane's conquests bring him right up against the only other power in the region that could possibly match his ambition, the mighty Ottoman Empire. And it was led by the equally proud, equally scary Sultan Bajazet, a guy nicknamed the Thunderbolt. This was always going to be a clash of titans.
And it got personal, fast. In the letters they wrote back and forth, Tamerlane basically calls Bajazet a pismire, an ant, trying to pick a fight with an elephant. Bajazet fires right back, mocking Tamerlane's army compared to his own elite soldiers, the Janissaries. And then he makes this incredibly intense vow about divorcing his own wives if he loses, a massive self-insult in that culture. This was a war of egos just as much as it was a war of empires.
All the insults, all the maneuvering, it all led them here, to the plains of Angora, in what is now Turkey. On July 28, 1402, two of the biggest armies on the planet finally met in a battle that would decide the fate of Asia.
And the result? A total, crushing victory for Tamerlane. So how'd he do it? Well, first, he was a tactical genius, with decades of non-stop war under his belt. But even more important, he was a master of psychological warfare. He actually convinced a huge chunk of Bajazet's army to switch sides during the battle. Bajazet's elite Janissaries, they fought like lions, but they were completely surrounded. And the Sultan himself, the Thunderbolt, was captured trying to escape.
So what happened next became the most famous and the most debated story of Tamerlane's entire life. We're talking about the legend of the Iron Cage. And this is a really cool bit of historical detective work, trying to figure out what was real and what was myth.
So here it is, the big question. Is the story true? Did Tamerlane actually put the captured Ottoman Sultan in an iron cage and parade him around his camp like a wild animal for everyone to mock? Let's look at what the sources say.
Okay, so on one side, you have Tamerlane's own official court historians, and they paint a picture of a gracious winner. They say Tamerlane treated Bajazet with honor, felt sorry for him, and even promised to give him his kingdom back. But then, on the other side, you have this mountain of evidence saying the opposite. You've got French, Italian, Arab, Greek, and even Turkish historians all telling the story of the cage. One Greek diplomat even said he talked to old soldiers who swore they had seen it with their own eyes.
So what's the truth? The historian Gibbon comes up with a pretty brilliant compromise. He argues the cage was probably real, but the story got twisted. He thinks Tamerlane probably treated Bajazet well at first, but after the Sultan tried to escape, Tamerlane had to put him under a harsher restraint, basically a mobile, cage-like prison, not to humiliate him, but just to keep him from running away again. The truth, like it so often does, is probably somewhere in the middle.
After defeating the Ottomans, Tamerlane was the undisputed master of Asia, no question. But what kind of legacy does a man like that actually leave behind? You know, what happens when the storm finally passes?
At 70 years old, his body was failing, but his ambition was as strong as ever. Tamerlane gathered an army of 200,000 men for his final, ultimate conquest, the Ming dynasty in China. But he never made it. He got sick on the march and died, and his grandest plan of all died with him.
And this right here tells the whole story of his legacy. Tamerlane's empire was a personal project. It was held together by his will and his will alone. The moment he died, it evaporated with his life, just collapsing into civil war. Now compare that to the Ottoman Empire, the one he almost destroyed. Their system, their institution, was stronger than any one man. As Gibbon wrote, the massy trunk was bent, but it just grew back, and it lasted for centuries more.
So in the end, Gibbon delivers this absolutely damning verdict. For all his genius, for all his talk about bringing order to the world, the sheer scale of the death and destruction he caused was just so much worse than the chaos he claimed he was fixing. He was, ultimately, a scourge.
Which leaves us with one last thought to chew on. Tamerlane spent 50 years perfecting the art of conquest, but his empire died the second he did because he never really learned how to govern. He built an incredible machine for war, but not a state that could live without him. So was his ultimate failure just not being able to build something more permanent than fear and more lasting than himself?
All right, let's dive into this. We're going to talk about the story of a dying empire and the absolutely incredible, completely unintended consequences of its final desperate gamble.
Now, for the last emperors of the Byzantine Empire, the true inheritors of Rome, this wasn't some hypothetical question. It was pretty much the only question that mattered. So, picture this. It's the 14th century. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, basically the last piece of Rome still standing, is on its knees. It's getting squeezed from all sides by the unstoppable Ottoman Turks. Their whole world has shrunk to pretty much just the city of Constantinople. Their only hope, well, it was their estranged Christian cousins over in the West.
The historian Edward Gibbon, he pointed out this really simple, kind of brutal pattern. He called it a thermometer of their prosperity or distress. Basically, the more desperate the Byzantines got, the nicer they suddenly were to their old rivals, the Pope and the Latin Church in Rome.
Funny how that works, right?
And that desperation, it kicked off a whole century of diplomatic missions to the West. A century of begging, really, with each attempt getting more and more humiliating.
Yeah, for 100 years, you see this exact same pattern play out over and over again. The Byzantine emperors would plead for help, they sent envoys, they wrote letters, they even went themselves, and every single time, the West, especially the Pope, demanded the same price: total religious submission. They'd say, sure, maybe we'll send an army, but first, you have to give up your Orthodox faith and accept our authority. And you can just feel the contempt in the language they used. In 1339, Pope Benedict XII sends a reply, but he doesn't address it to the Emperor of the Romans. No, he addresses it to the moderator of the Greeks. That's a massive diplomatic insult. He's refusing to even acknowledge the emperor's proper title. Ouch.
The humiliation really hit rock bottom in 1370. I mean, you can't make this up. After another one of these fruitless trips, Emperor John Palaeologus gets arrested on his way home in Venice for debt. He literally couldn't pay his travel bills. And here's the kicker, his own son, who's ruling back home, refused to send the money. It turned into this crazy family drama. Thankfully, his younger, more dutiful son, Manuel, had to sell his own things to bail his dad out of jail. The Emperor of Rome in debtor's prison. It's just wild.
So that same son, Manuel, he eventually becomes emperor himself. And, facing the same impossible odds, he decides to go on his own unprecedented 2-year fundraising trip across what his people basically considered the barbarian West.
And this was a huge deal, because for the first time, the sophisticated Byzantines got a real up-close look at these powerful European kingdoms. What did they think? Well, they saw the Germans as brave and hardworking, but kind of disorganized. The French were arrogant but super rich.
And the English? Well, the English were tough warriors with a very peculiar custom. The Byzantine historian who was traveling with the emperor wrote that the English just casually lent and borrowed their wives and daughters. Now, Gibbon thinks this was just a massive misunderstanding of the common English custom of a welcome kiss, a simple peck on the cheek as a greeting. The Greeks saw this and found it absolutely scandalous. Talk about a culture shock.
So, Manuel's grand tour was a big spectacle. He stayed in the Louvre, he was welcomed by kings, the whole 9 yards. But after all the lavish parties and polite compliments, he got no real military support. So the stage was set for one last all-or-nothing bet, this time by his son, John II.
Now Manuel, by this point, he's a wise, world-weary old man. He's seen it all. And on his deathbed, he gives his son some cynical but probably pretty smart advice. He says, look, use the idea of uniting the churches as a diplomatic weapon. Talk about it. Threaten the Turks with it. But whatever you do, never, ever actually go through with it. He knew it would be a disaster.
But his son, John, he was young, he was rash, and he did the exact opposite. He completely ignored his dad's warning. In 1437, he sails with hundreds of his top clergy to Italy, and he bets the entire fate of his empire on this one huge meeting, the Council of Florence.
What happened at that council? Well, it wasn't really a meeting of the minds. The Greeks were basically trapped. The Pope was footing all their bills, so they were financially dependent on him. They were exhausted, they were homesick, and they were getting pressure from all sides. A union was eventually just forced through, not because they agreed on theology, but because of the sheer desperation of the Byzantines. They signed the papers, but you can bet their hearts weren't in it.
So the whole political gamble, a total, complete failure. The big Western Crusade that was promised never really happened. The Union was furiously rejected by the people back in Constantinople, and just over a decade later in 1453, the city and the very last piece of the Roman Empire fell to the Turks.
On the surface? Oh yeah, it failed spectacularly.
And yet, that failure sparked something so much more important, something way more world-changing than just saving a dying empire.
Think about it like this. Their mission to save their own house completely failed. But the intellectual keys they were carrying in their pockets, they accidentally unlocked the future of the entire Western world. Their failure to get an army led to a cultural rebirth of just astounding proportions. Because all of this travel, all these humiliating negotiations, it created this steady stream of people and ideas flowing from east to west. The Byzantines brought their most brilliant scholars to argue their side, and in their luggage, they carried the treasures of their civilization, ancient Greek manuscripts of Plato, Homer, Aristotle, texts that had been totally lost or forgotten in Europe for 1,000 years.
And as Gibbon puts it so perfectly, the timing was just right. This desperate, failed political project was the very thing that transported the intellectual treasures of the ancient world right into a modern Italy that was ready and waiting for them. It's what sparked the flame of the Renaissance.
So, it kind of leaves us with this final thought about the strange winding paths of history, right? The Byzantines bet everything they had to save their past, and they lost. But in the process, they accidentally gave the West its future. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most world-changing consequences are the ones nobody ever intended.
All right, so today we're jumping into the final, desperate years of an empire that somehow managed to last for 1,000 years. Picture this. It's the mid-15th century. The Byzantine Empire, which is really the last piece of the old Roman Empire, is just a shadow of what it once was. It's become this tiny little island of Christianity, completely surrounded by the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. And its survival? Well, it's hanging by a thread. And get this. That wasn't some propaganda from an enemy. That line came from one of their own top scholars, a guy named Emmanuel Chrysoloras. Even for the people actually living there, the great city of Constantinople felt less like a living, breathing capital and more like this magnificent tomb, just a ghost of a glorious past. So to really get why they were so desperate, we first have to understand what was on the line. What exactly was this city that they were fighting to save? This ghost of glory? What's really fascinating is how people back then saw their own city. Chrysoloras makes this incredible comparison to its ancient mother, Rome. On the one hand, you have Rome, the historic original, a city of gods and Caesars, still majestic even in its ruins. And then there's Constantinople, the daughter, the perfect copy, built by design right on the most commanding spot on Earth. It was literally the gateway between Europe and Asia. But see, that was the idea, not the reality. The truth on the ground was that the city was literally crumbling. Ancient sculptures were gone, beautiful buildings had been torn down, their precious marble actually burned for lime. Can you imagine? The tombs of the emperors were broken and scattered. The city was a ruin, and its decay was just being sped up by storms, earthquakes, and simple neglect. So with their whole world collapsing around them, the Byzantine emperor, John VIII, decides to make a truly desperate bargain. It was a last-ditch effort to find a savior for his empire. The emperor's only real hope was a new crusade from the Catholic West. But that help came with a jaw-dropping price. He would have to end a schism that had lasted for centuries and basically submit his Eastern Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. And at the Council of Florence, facing total destruction, the Byzantines, they agreed. But this wasn't just some political deal. No. This struck right at the heart of their religious identity. The clergy who signed this union were immediately branded as traitors. They were called Azymites, which was this powerful, nasty insult that referred to the Latin practice of using unleavened bread in communion. It sounds like a small detail, but to them, it symbolized a massive betrayal of their faith. And the regret? Oh, it was immediate and it was deep. As soon as the church leaders who signed the deal got back home, they were met with absolute fury. They just buckled under the pressure, publicly crying about what they'd done, saying they'd been tricked by the hopes and fears of a transitory life. The city was an open revolt. The new patriarch, who was pro-union, found his own massive cathedral of St. Sophia completely empty. The clergy refused to serve. The people saw the deal not as salvation, but as damnation. So the attempt to unite the church had actually just created a new, bitter civil war inside their own walls. And yet, and this is the crazy part, the deal worked. Over in the West, Pope Eugenius, feeling good about the union, actually managed to rally the Christian kingdoms for one more great crusade. The plan? Save Constantinople and push the Turks out of Europe for good. And at first, the plan unfolded with incredible success. An army came together under the young king Ladislaus of Poland and Hungary and a truly amazing general, John Huniades. They marched south, and Huniades pulled off 2 stunning victories against the Ottomans. The Sultan, Amurath II, was so shaken that he offered a super favorable 10-year peace treaty, which was then solemnly sworn on both the Christian gospel and the Muslim Quran. This was it. Total victory. The gamble had paid off big time. The Turks were stopped, Christian lands were given back, and the Byzantine Empire had a 10-year breathing spell, all secured by the most sacred oaths you can imagine. But you knew there was a but coming, right? That moment of triumph was fleeting. The ink on the treaty was barely dry when the Pope's man on the scene, Cardinal Julian, decided that, well, peace with an infidel isn't really peace at all. And this right here is the moment it all goes horribly wrong. Cardinal Julian convinces the young King Ladislaus that an oath made to a Muslim is invalid in the eyes of God. He literally says, "In his name I absolve your perjury and sanctify your arms." He told the king to break a sacred treaty, promising to take all the sin onto his own head. It's just a shocking moment. I mean, think about it. A holy man is arguing that for a holy cause, a sacred promise means absolutely nothing. Persuaded by the cardinal, King Ladislaus agreed. He tore up the treaty and marched his army back to war. This was a catastrophic mistake. Many of the crusaders, totally disgusted by this dishonorable act, just abandoned the cause and went home. So the army that was left was a shadow of its former self. And when it finally met the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna, well, as you can see here, they were outnumbered 3-1. 20,000 against 60,000. The odds were not good. The scene at the start of the battle is just legendary. The Ottoman Sultan, Amurath ordered the broken Christian treaty to be carried on the point of a lance for everyone to see. He then looked up to heaven and called not on his own prophet, but on Jesus, asking Jesus himself to punish those who had sworn in his name and then so shamelessly betrayed their oath. The battle was a complete disaster. King Ladislaus, in a desperate, reckless charge, was cut down. His head was placed on a spear, and a Turkish soldier held it up, shouting for the Christian army to see. The crusade just collapsed into a bloody rout. So, game over. King Ladislaus was dead. Cardinal Julian, the guy who architected this whole disaster, vanished in the chaos. And the rumor was, he was murdered by his own men for the gold he was carrying. Only the great general Huniades managed to escape the carnage. In the end, the Battle of Varna was the death blow. The last great Christian army that could have possibly saved Constantinople was just annihilated. The last best hope from the West was gone, and the empire was now truly, utterly alone. And from that point on, events moved really fast. 4 years after the Varna disaster, Emperor John, the man who gambled everything on that union with Rome, he died. He was succeeded by his brother, Constantine XI, and just 2 years after that, the old Sultan Amurath died, and his young, brilliant, and completely ruthless son, Mehmed II, came to the Ottoman throne. And if you need one fact to understand the empire's utter helplessness at this point, it's this. The man who claims the title of Roman emperor, a successor to Augustus and Justinian, he could not formally take his own throne until he received the official permission of the Ottoman Sultan. The empire was already a vassal state in all but name. Which brings us right to our final question. Constantine XI inherited a city in ruins, a church that was tearing itself apart, and an enemy whose new leader had one single, all-consuming ambition, to conquer Constantinople. The last great gamble had failed spectacularly. So you have to ask yourself, what hope could possibly be left?